If you grew up in the 90s, you probably had a few favorite teen actors. They were everywhere, from movies to magazines. But have you ever found yourself wondering what their lives are like now, after those famous roles? And perhaps one of the most heartbreaking stories belongs to Nick Stahl. He's best known for his role as John Connor in Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. It seemed like the perfect launchpad for his career, but in reality it was the beginning of a long downward spiral. He battled addiction, disappeared from the public eye multiple times, and lost it all. His story is not an isolated tragedy, but rather an inevitable product of a Hollywood in a volatile period of transition. And this is where our story truly begins. To understand the world that shaped Nick Stahl, we have to travel back to a time before social media, before the 24-hour news cycle as we know it, and before the term child star carried the heavy, ominous weight it does today. The early 1990s were a fascinating transitional period for Hollywood. The bombastic, high-concept blockbusters of the 80s were still dominant, but a powerful countercurrent was rising from the underground. The independent film movement. Directors like Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, and Gus Van Sant were creating gritty, character-driven stories that felt raw, real, and a world away from the glossy perfection of the studio system. This new wave of filmmaking created a demand for a different kind of actor. The perfectly coiffed, muscle-bound heroes of the previous decade were making way for more introspective, complicated, and often troubled protagonists. It was the era of slacker culture, of grunge music, of a certain romantic melancholy that celebrated authenticity over artifice. And at the heart of this movement were young actors who could embody that spirit, actors who looked like real people, who could convey deep wells of emotion with just a flicker in their eyes. River Phoenix was the patron saint of this movement, an actor of almost supernatural talent and sensitivity. His performances in films like Stand By Me and My Own Private Idaho set a new standard for young actors. He wasn't just playing a part, he seemed to be channeling a profound, almost painful truth. This was the environment that was waiting for a boy like Nick Stahl. Born on December 5, 1979 in Harlingen, Texas, and raised in Dallas, Nick's childhood was far from the glitz of Hollywood. His mother, Donna Lynn, worked to support Nick and his two sisters after his father left the family. From a very young age, Nick had a creative spark. He was drawn to performance, and his mother, seeing his potential, encouraged him. He started acting in local plays and commercials when he was just a child. There's an innocence to those early beginnings, a local kid with a passion, supported by a loving mom. It's a story we've heard before, but what set Nick apart was a maturity, a seriousness that seemed far beyond his years. It was in his eyes, a deep, soulful gaze that hinted at a knowledge and a sadness that a child shouldn't yet possess. His mother drove him to auditions, nurturing his dream. He landed a commercial for Burger King, a rite of passage for many aspiring young actors. But his big break, the moment that would catapult him from a kid in Dallas to a name in Hollywood, came from a place no one could have predicted. In the early 1990s, Mel Gibson was arguably the biggest movie star in the world. Fresh off the success of the Lethal Weapon franchise, he was at the peak of his power and decided to step behind the camera for his directorial debut. The film was The Man Without a Face, a sensitive, poignant drama based on the 1972 novel by Isabel Holland. The story revolved around a lonely, troubled boy named Chuck Norstad, who forms an unlikely friendship with a reclusive and disfigured former teacher, Justin McLeod. The role of McLeod was perfect for Gibson, allowing him to showcase a different, more vulnerable side of his talent. But the success of the entire film rested on finding the right boy to play Chuck. The character was complex. He was angry, yearning for a father figure, and desperate for connection. It required an actor who could be both tough and fragile, cynical and hopeful. Gibson launched a massive nationwide casting call. He and his casting directors saw thousands of young actors. They were looking for that rare, unteachable quality, authenticity, and they found it in a 12-year-old from Texas named Nick Stahl. Gibson later recalled the moment he saw Nick's audition tape. He said there was something ancient in his eyes, a depth and an understanding of human pain that was simply astonishing in someone so young. It wasn't just that Nick could deliver the lines, it was that he seemed to understand the subtext, the unspoken loneliness and longing that defined the character. For Nick, it was a whirlwind. One minute he was a kid going to school in Dallas. The next he was on a plane to be screen tested with Mel Gibson. He got the part, and his life changed forever. The production of The Man Without a Face, released in 1993, became his trial by fire. He was the co-lead in a major motion picture, acting opposite and being directed by a global superstar. The pressure would have been immense for any actor, let alone a 12-year-old with no major film experience. But by all accounts, Nick was a natural. Gibson took him under his wing, mentoring him and creating a safe environment on set. He recognized the raw, intuitive talent he had found and was careful to nurture it. The relationship between their characters on screen, that of a mentor and a student, was mirrored by their relationship off screen. Nick delivered a performance that was nothing short of breathtaking. He captured Chuck's sullen anger, his desperate vulnerability, and his gradual, hopeful opening up to the world with a nuance and subtlety that actors twice his age would struggle to achieve. When The Man Without a Face was released, the critics were effusive in their praise, not just for Gibson's sensitive direction, but for the astonishing debut of his young co-star. Roger Ebert wrote that Stahl's performance was informed by a quiet, waiting watchfulness. He was nominated for a Young Artist Award, and suddenly everyone in Hollywood knew who Nick Stahl was. He was the new kid on the block, the next great talent, another one of those soulful, serious young actors in the mold of River Phoenix or Leonardo DiCaprio. His future seemed limitless, a blank page waiting to be filled with brilliant performances and incredible success. But as the story of his generation would so often prove, the brightest light can often cast the darkest shadow. The very sensitivity that made him a brilliant actor might also have been the thing that left him most vulnerable to the darkness that lay ahead. The success of The Man Without a Face opened every conceivable door in Hollywood for the young Nick Stahl. In the blink of an eye, he was no longer just a kid from Texas with a raw, undeniable talent. He was a proven commodity, a critically acclaimed actor who had held his own opposite one of the industry's biggest stars, under that same star's meticulous direction. The years that immediately followed were a whirlwind of scripts, auditions, and film sets, a crucial and often perilous period where Nick had to navigate the treacherous waters of transitioning from a child sensation into a working adolescent, and eventually a serious adult actor. This is a journey that has famously claimed countless promising careers. For every Jodie Foster, Natalie Portman, or Christian Bale who successfully makes the leap, the landscape of Hollywood is littered with the ghosts of others who either faded into obscurity or were consumed by the immense pressures of growing up under the relentless glare of the public eye. The path is a minefield of awkward growth spurts, typecasting, and the sudden disorienting loss of the cute kid factor that made them famous in the first place. Nick, however, seemed to be charting this dangerous course with a wisdom and maturity that belied his age. Guided by his mother, Donna, who remained the steadfast anchor in his burgeoning career, he made a series of deliberate and intelligent choices. They didn't chase the easy paychecks or the glossy, superficial roles in teen comedies that would have capitalized on his burgeoning fame. Instead, they were consistently drawn to more complex, challenging, and often darker material that allowed him to stretch his acting muscles and build a resume based on craft rather than celebrity. He appeared in the 1995 Disney adventure film, Tall Tale, The Unbelievable Adventures of Pecos Bill, a more conventional and family-friendly project that kept him visible, but it was his work in independent and edgier films that would truly define this era and signal his artistic intentions. A pivotal film during this transition was 1998's Disturbing Behavior. Arriving at the height of the late 90s teen horror revival, a cycle kicked off by the meta-slasher Scream, the film, on its surface, was a slickly produced teen thriller. But beneath the genre trappings, it was a surprisingly sharp satire about conformity, teenage alienation, and the immense pressure to be perfect in a world that feels increasingly insane. Nick played Gavin Strick, one of the high school's misfits, and a conspiracy theorist who is the first to notice that his perfect classmates in the Blue Ribbon program are being systematically transformed into placid, emotionless drones. It was a role that tapped directly into that outsider energy he possessed so naturally, that quality of being an old soul in a young body, watching the world with a wary, knowing, and deeply intelligent eye. He starred alongside a cast of other rising stars of the 90s, like James Marsden and Katie Holmes, and while the film itself received mixed reviews, Nick's performance was a standout, providing the story with its conscience and its tragic, Cassandra-like prophet of doom. But the true turning point, the pair of films that would detonate any remaining notion of him as a mere child actor and announce his arrival as a serious, fearless, and uncompromising adult talent, came in a single remarkable year, 2001. The first of these was director Larry Clark's controversial and deeply unsettling film, Bully. Clark had already established himself as one of cinema's most unflinching provocateurs with his 1995 debut, Kids, a film that shocked audiences with its raw, documentary-style portrayal of disaffected, nihilistic youth. Bully was an even more disturbing endeavor, based on the horrifying true story of a group of teenagers in a dead-end Florida town who, pushed to their limits by their abusive and domineering friend, Bobby Kent, conspired to murder him. The film was brutal, explicit in its depiction of sex and violence, and deeply, profoundly unsettling. Nick took on the central role of Marty Puccio, Bobby Kent's tormented best friend, who is goaded by his girlfriend and their circle of friends into orchestrating the murder. It was a role that required him to descend into incredibly dark and morally ambiguous places. Marty is not a hero. He is weak, pathetic, easily manipulated, and trapped in a cycle of psychological and physical abuse from which he sees no escape other than a final, horrific act of violence. Nick's performance was terrifyingly real and utterly devoid of vanity. He disappeared completely inside the character's clammy, sweaty skin, embodying his simmering resentment, his paralyzing fear, and his tragic, contemptible weakness. There was no attempt to make the character likable or to soften his pathetic nature. Nick bravely showed the ugly, uncomfortable truth of a young man crumbling under pressure and making a series of catastrophic decisions. The film remains for many an incredibly difficult watch, but Nick's performance was an undeniable tour de force. It was a bold declaration that the sensitive boy from The Man Without a Face had grown into an actor of remarkable range, courage, and psychological depth. As if to prove that his fearlessness was matched by his versatility, That same year, he delivered another powerful, critically acclaimed performance in a very different kind of film, Todd Field's directorial debut, In the Bedroom. This was a quiet, meticulous, and devastatingly sad adult drama about a middle-class New England couple, played with shattering grace by Sissy Spacek and Tom Wilkinson, who are forced to grapple with an unthinkable tragedy. Nick played their son, Frank Fowler, a recent college graduate in the midst of a passionate, doomed romance with an older separated woman, Marisa Tomei. Although his character is tragically killed by his lover's estranged husband early in the film, his presence and the memory of his gentle, loving nature looms over the entire story, fueling the grief and rage that slowly consumes his parents. His performance as Frank is the polar opposite of his work in Bully. It is filled with a tender, hopeful, youthful optimism that makes the subsequent violence all the more heartbreaking and senseless. He is the film's vibrant, beating heart before that heart is brutally ripped out. The film was a critical sensation, a slow burn masterpiece that earned 5 Academy Award nominations, including a rare and coveted nomination for Best Picture. For Nick, being a key catalytic part of such a prestigious and artistically significant drama was a major step. He was no longer just a promising young actor, he was an integral part of the ensemble in one of the most celebrated films of the year. He was working with legendary Oscar-winning actors and acclaimed directors, and he was proving time and again that he absolutely belonged in their company. This period from the late 90s to the early 2000s was the peak of his artistic ascent. He was in his early 20s and he had painstakingly built a resume that most actors would envy at any age. He had done what so few are able to do. He had successfully transitioned from a celebrated child star into a respected adult actor, celebrated not for his box office clout, but for his intensity, his profound vulnerability, and his unwavering willingness to take on difficult, challenging roles that others might shy away from. The future looked incredibly bright, a horizon of limitless potential. Having successfully navigated the minefield of adolescence and established himself as one of the most fearless and respected actors of his generation, Nick Stahl stood at the zenith of his artistic credibility. He had resisted the pull of easy fame, choosing instead a path of integrity that had earned him a resume filled with complex, unforgettable performances. It was from this peak of critical respect that Hollywood came calling with an offer of a completely different magnitude, a chance to not just act in a blockbuster, but to become the face of a legendary franchise, a move that promised to transform him from an indie darling into a global superstar overnight. The role was John Connor. For an entire generation of film fans, that name was not just a character, it was a myth, a legend etched into the very fabric of cinematic history. He was the future leader of the human resistance, the savior destined to lead humanity in its apocalyptic war against the sentient machines of Skynet. He was the heart and soul of the Terminator franchise, a series that had redefined the action and science fiction genres. In James Cameron's 1991 masterpiece, Terminator 2: Judgment Day, the role of the young John Connor had been brilliantly and indelibly played by another gifted but notoriously troubled young actor, Edward Furlong. Furlong's portrayal of the rebellious, street-smart kid who finds an unlikely father figure in a killer cyborg was a cultural touchstone, a perfect blend of adolescent swagger and deep-seated vulnerability. His performance was iconic, but by the early 2000s, when a third film, Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines, was finally greenlit after years in development hell, the landscape had changed. Edward Furlong's own well-documented and tragic struggles with substance abuse had made him, in the cold, hard calculus of Hollywood, uninsurable for a blockbuster production with a budget approaching an astronomical $200 million. The studio needed a new John Connor. The search was on for a young actor who could not only handle the immense physical demands of the role, but also capture the psychological weight of a man haunted by a future he knows is coming. They turned to Nick Stahl. On paper, it was a decision of casting genius. Here was an actor who had spent the last decade proving his formidable talent in a series of intense, psychologically complex roles. He had the critical acclaim. He possessed a brooding intensity that felt authentic and unforced, and he even bore a passing physical resemblance to a grown-up Furlong. It was a perfect convergence. For Nick, this was the shot at the A-list, the kind of career-defining role that turns a respected actor into a household name and a global superstar. It was the chance to bridge the gap between his indie credibility and mainstream box office success, a move that could set him up for life. He accepted the role, stepping into the shoes of a cinematic icon and onto the biggest stage of his life. The pressure was astronomical. Not only was he taking over an iconic role beloved by millions, but he was also sharing the screen with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was returning to his most famous character after a 12-year absence. The production itself was a colossal machine, a logistical behemoth of stunts, special effects, and marketing, a world away from the intimate, character-focused sets of films like Bully and In the Bedroom. For an actor known for his quiet, introspective process, being at the center of a summer tentpole film was a jarring and alien experience. Compounding the pressure was the way the character of John Connor had been reimagined for this new installment. Instead of the confident, budding leader in training we last saw in T2, this version of John was a drifter, living completely off the grid, haunted by a future he wasn't sure he wanted to face. He was anxious, uncertain, and deeply troubled, a man running from a destiny he felt wholly unprepared for. It was a complex, downbeat, and psychologically nuanced take on the character that, while fitting Nick's established strengths as a dramatic actor, didn't quite align with audience expectations for a triumphant, hero-centric summer blockbuster. He was tasked with playing a man riddled with doubt and trauma in a film built around explosions and catchphrases. Nick did his best with the material, bringing his signature vulnerability and interiority to the role. He skillfully portrayed a young man crushed by the weight of the world, but he was often overshadowed by the sheer spectacle of the film, the breathtaking action sequences, the relentless new female Terminator, and of course the monumental presence of Schwarzenegger. When the film was released in the summer of 2003, reviews for his performance were decidedly mixed. Some critics praised his attempt to bring a new, darker dimension to the character, applauding the psychological depth he brought to the role. But many others found him underwhelming, lacking the charisma and rebellious edge that Furlong had made so memorable. To them, he seemed lost in the machine, a sensitive indie actor dropped into the massive, clanking gears of a Hollywood blockbuster that didn't quite know what to do with his subtle talents. The film was a significant financial success, grossing over $433 million worldwide, but it failed to achieve the cultural impact or critical adoration of its predecessors. More importantly, it didn't launch Nick into the stratosphere of stardom as everyone had predicted. There's a strange and tragic irony to the role of John Connor, one that has fueled whispers of a curse for years. Nearly every actor who has played the adult version of the character has been plagued by significant personal or professional difficulties. Furlong's battles with addiction are well known. Christian Bale, who took on the role in 2009's Terminator Salvation, became infamous for a profanity-laced on-set tirade that went viral. For Nick Stahl, playing the savior of humanity seemed to coincide with the beginning of his own personal apocalypse. The film that was meant to be his coronation instead became a strange and unsettling turning point, the moment when the trajectory of his life and career began to bend downward toward the shadows. In the immediate aftermath of Terminator 3, however, Nick's career didn't fall off a cliff. In fact, in what seemed like a deliberate course correction back toward the artistically ambitious work he craved, he landed what would become one of his most memorable and acclaimed roles. From 2003 to 2005, he starred in the HBO series Carnival. This was a show unlike anything else on television then or now. Set during the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression, it was a sprawling, mystical, and often baffling saga about a traveling carnival that becomes the unwitting battleground for a timeless, Manichaean struggle between good and evil. Nick was cast as the show's protagonist, Ben Hawkins, a young chain gang fugitive with miraculous, terrifying healing powers who was taken in by the carnival. He was the show's moral center, its central mystery, and its reluctant messiah. Ben was a character defined by his haunted silence, his deep-seated pain, and the immense, terrifying power he could neither understand nor control. It was a role that played perfectly to Nick's greatest strengths as an actor. So much of his performance was nonverbal, conveyed through those famously expressive, sorrowful eyes. He could project a world of hurt, confusion, and a reluctant, burdensome destiny without saying a single word. Carnival was a critical darling, developing a passionate, obsessive cult following for its dense literary mythology, its stunning Dust Bowl-era visuals, and its superb ensemble cast. For 2 seasons, Nick Stahl was the face of one of the most artistically ambitious and intellectually demanding shows on television. It felt like a triumphant return to the kind of complex, character-driven work where he had always thrived, a powerful antidote to the impersonal, spectacle-driven nature of the Terminator blockbuster. But the show was notoriously expensive to produce, and its challenging, slow-burn narrative meant its ratings were never massive. HBO, in a move that still angers the show's devoted fans to this day, abruptly canceled Carnival after its 2nd season, leaving its grand, overarching story frustratingly unresolved. For Nick, the cancellation was another significant professional blow. It was the last truly high-profile, artistically satisfying project he would lead for a very long time. The abrupt cancellation of Carnival marked the end of the last great, artistically fulfilling chapter of his early career. As the professional momentum slowed and the high-profile roles became fewer and farther between, the private struggles he had long kept at bay began to intensify. The coping mechanisms he had used for years to manage his anxiety were no longer sufficient. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon of his personal life was about to make landfall, unleashing a destructive force that would wash away his career, his family, and nearly himself in a devastating public collapse. The pressures of a life spent in the public eye, especially a life that began there in childhood, are a corrosive force that most of us can barely comprehend. For Nick Stahl, the seeds of his later devastating struggles may have been sown long before anyone, perhaps even he, noticed them taking root. In interviews given years later, with the clarity of sobriety, he spoke about starting to drink alcohol at the tender age of 13, not long after his lauded debut in The Man Without a Face. It wasn't about rebellion or partying. It was a form of self-medication, a way to quiet the relentless anxiety, the crippling self-consciousness, and the persistent feeling of being an outsider even when he was the center of attention. Alcohol was the first escape, a temporary balm for a sensitivity that was both the source of his artistic gift and the root of his private pain. It would not be his last. As he moved from his teens into his 20s, the pressures mounted exponentially. The strange hollow victory of Terminator 3, the weight of unmet expectations, the professional blow of Carnival's cancellation, and the underlying anxieties that had always been his constant companions began to coalesce into a perfect storm. He started experimenting with other drugs, and soon, what began as a recreational attempt to numb the noise spiraled into a powerful, full-blown addiction. For a time, he managed to hide it. This is the insidious nature of the disease, especially for a high-functioning, intelligent person like a professional actor. He was still showing up to work, delivering performances, and maintaining a veneer of normalcy. He fell in love, and in 2009 he married a fellow actress, Rose Murphy. In 2010 they welcomed a daughter, Marlo. On the surface, he was building a life, a family. He had responsibilities, reasons to stay grounded, but the addiction had its own dark, inexorable gravitational pull. His career, once a blazing ascent, began to falter and dim. The prestigious projects with acclaimed directors and Oscar-winning co-stars gave way to smaller parts in independent films and a string of direct-to-video releases that went largely unnoticed. The light that had once burned so brightly in his eyes, the light that Roger Ebert had described as a quiet, waiting watchfulness, began to be replaced by a haunted, distant look that wasn't just for the cameras anymore. He was losing control, and his private, desperate struggle was about to unravel in a series of painful, public, and deeply humiliating spectacles. The first real public tremor that signaled the impending earthquake came in February of 2012. His wife Rose filed a court report stating that she had been forced to separate from Nick. In the documents, she alleged that his drug use was out of control and that she feared for the safety of their 2-year-old daughter, Marlo, requesting that Nick's visitation be limited and monitored. This is the moment a private hell becomes a public spectacle. The headlines are brutal. The intimate details of a family's pain laid bare for the world's consumption. For an actor who had always been intensely private, known for his quiet seriousness rather than a flashy lifestyle, it must have been a devastating blow. And then just a few months later, in May of 2012, the story took a terrifying and dramatic turn. Rose Murphy reported her husband missing. He hadn't been seen for several days, and his last known location was the Skid Row area of downtown Los Angeles, a part of the city notorious for its large homeless population and its open, unforgiving drug market. The news exploded across the internet and television. Terminator star Nick Stahl missing. The headlines were everywhere. Suddenly his face was back in the news, not for a new film role, but on cable news chyrons and in tabloid articles, next to desperate pleas from his wife and family for him to please just come home. The public, the media, and his fans were left to speculate in a grim media frenzy. Had he been the victim of foul play in one of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods? Or had he simply succumbed to his demons and disappeared into the anonymous, desperate world of full-blown addiction? For 5 agonizing days, there was nothing but silence. His friends and family feared the absolute worst. The story was a chilling, real-time echo of the fates of so many other talented young actors who had been consumed by their addictions. It felt as though everyone was bracing for a tragic, inevitable, and all too familiar conclusion. Then, just as suddenly as he had vanished, he resurfaced. He sent an email to friends and family, letting them know he was alive. He apologized and announced that he was checking himself into rehab, promising he would stay for 30 days. There was a collective global sigh of relief. It seemed like the crisis had been the wake-up call, the rock-bottom moment that would finally force him to confront his demons. But the cruel, cunning reality of addiction is that rock bottom can always be lower. Just a month later, he walked out of the rehab facility against medical advice. In July, he went missing again. This time, his wife took to Twitter, her desperation palpable in the public plea, "I'm looking for my husband, last seen at a friend's home in Hollywood." Once again, the frantic cycle of fear and searching began. He was found a few days later, but the pattern was now terrifyingly clear. He was caught in a vicious, seemingly unbreakable cycle of use, disappearance, and brief failed attempts at recovery. The remainder of 2012 and 2013 was a blur of increasingly grim and public incidents. In December 2012, he was arrested in a Hollywood adult film store for allegedly committing a lewd act. Police officers, who were conducting an undercover sting operation, claimed they saw him engaging in an inappropriate act with another man in a private viewing booth. The charges were later dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the damage to his reputation was immense. The headlines were salacious and humiliating, reducing a once respected actor, a man who had shared the screen with Sissy Spacek and Tom Wilkinson in a Best Picture-nominated film, to a sordid punchline. A few months later, in June 2013, he was arrested again, this time in a motel room in Hollywood. He was taken into custody along with 3 other individuals on suspicion of using methamphetamine. The mugshot that circulated online from that arrest was devastating. It was the physical manifestation of his disease. The face that had once been so full of youthful sensitivity and intelligence was now gaunt, hollow-cheeked, and etched with the unmistakable ravages of addiction. His eyes, once his greatest tool as an actor, the ancient eyes that had captivated Mel Gibson, looked empty, lost, and utterly defeated. This was the public face of his rock bottom. In that photo, he was no longer a movie star. He was a statistic, another casualty of a disease that does not care about fame, talent, or past glories. He had become one of the ghosts he was once compared to. The haunting image of that mugshot marked the absolute nadir of his public life, a definitive and shocking visual of a man who seemed utterly lost. But to simply observe this tragic endpoint is to miss the more complex and vital questions. How does a journey that began with such extraordinary promise lead to such a desolate place? The answer is not a simple one, involving a tangled web of personal demons, systemic industry pressures, and a predatory media culture that turned his private agony into public entertainment. To understand his fall is to dissect the very machinery that built him up and then cast him aside. To look at the mugshot from Nick Stahl's June 2013 arrest is to see the end point of a long and tragic trajectory. It is the physical manifestation of the private pain he had been trying to numb for years. But the salacious headlines and the shocking photograph only told a fraction of the story. Behind the public spectacle was a private hell of unimaginable desperation. In interviews he gave years later, after he had finally managed to claw his way back to sobriety, Nick spoke about this period with a harrowing and unflinching honesty. He described the all-consuming, tyrannical nature of his addiction to alcohol and drugs, particularly crystal meth. He talked about periods of homelessness, about living on the streets of Skid Row, about being completely and utterly disconnected from his wife, his young daughter, and the person he used to be. The craft that had defined his life since he was a 12-year-old boy was not just on the back burner. It was gone, completely erased by the singular, relentless focus of the addiction. It messes up your mind, he said with stark simplicity, and it makes you not care about things. For an artist whose work was built on empathy, sensitivity, and deep emotional connection, this was a profound existential loss. The disease had stolen not just his health, his family, and his career, but the very essence of who he was. He admitted that during his highly publicized disappearances, he was so deep in his addiction that he didn't want to be found. He was actively running away from anyone, his wife, his friends, his manager, who might try to help him, because helping him would mean separating him from the drugs that had become his only purpose, his only means of survival. His story is a powerful and terrifying illustration of how the disease of addiction isolates its victims. While the world saw a disgraced actor or a troubled star, the reality was a man who was profoundly ill and utterly alone, even when surrounded by the chaos of a city. His wife, Rose, was forced to make impossible choices, balancing her love for her husband with the primal need to protect their young daughter. Her public pleas were not just for him to come home. They were the desperate cries of a family being torn apart by a disease that takes no prisoners. The question of blame in a story like Nick Stahl's is complex and ultimately not a very useful exercise. It is easy to point fingers at the monstrous pressures of the Hollywood machine, at an industry that famously chews up and spits out young talent, at a voracious media that feasts on their downfall. And certainly there is a great deal of truth in all of that. The transition from child star to adult actor is a well-documented minefield. These young people are often the primary breadwinners for their families, surrounded by adults who have a vested financial interest in their continued success. They are denied the simple luxury of a normal childhood, forced to grow up far too fast in an artificial world of immense wealth, constant temptation, and suffocating scrutiny. The support systems that should be in place to protect them are often flimsy or non-existent. In the 90s and early 2000s, this was especially true. The public and industry conversation around mental health and addiction was nowhere near as nuanced or compassionate as it is today. There was a deep stigma attached, a pervasive sense of personal or moral failure rather than the recognition of a legitimate chronic medical disease. When a star started to spiral, the industry's response was often not to offer help, but to simply back away. The actor would be labeled as difficult to work with, unreliable, or the death knell for any career, uninsurable. Instead of receiving treatment, they were often ostracized, which only served to deepen their isolation and accelerate their descent into darkness. The media, too, played a significant and predatory role. The rise of tabloid journalism and the burgeoning internet gossip culture of the early 2000s, the era of TMZ and Perez Hilton, created a ravenous 24/7 appetite for celebrity scandals. The downfall of a beloved star was a commodity, a product to be packaged and sold for clicks and magazine sales. There was a kind of public schadenfreude, a grim satisfaction in watching the beautiful and the famous fall spectacularly from grace. The coverage of Nick's struggles was often devoid of empathy or understanding. He was treated as a spectacle, his profound pain and public humiliation turned into cheap, disposable entertainment. This relentless public shaming can be a massive barrier to recovery. How can someone possibly begin the difficult, vulnerable work of healing when their lowest moments are being mocked and dissected by millions of strangers? There is also, of course, the question of personal responsibility. In his later interviews, Nick Stahl himself is the first to admit that his choices were his own. He does not blame Hollywood or the media. He understands with the clarity of recovery that he made the decisions that led him down that dark path. This is a crucial and necessary part of the recovery process, taking ownership of one's actions. But it is also vital to understand the context in which those choices were made. Addiction is a disease of the brain, a recognized medical condition that hijacks the brain's reward system, impairs judgment, and compels self-destructive behavior. It often co-occurs with other mental health issues, like depression and anxiety, which Nick has also spoken about struggling with for most of his life. For someone with a predisposition to these conditions, the high pressure, high stakes, and often isolating environment of Hollywood can be like throwing gasoline on a smoldering fire. The real controversy surrounding Nick's story, then, is not about a single event or a single bad choice, but about the entire system and culture that allowed it to happen. His story, like those of Brad Renfro, who died of a heroin overdose in 2008 at the age of 25, and River Phoenix before him, forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is our collective responsibility as a culture? When we consume celebrity gossip that profits from someone's suffering, are we contributing to the problem? Does the industry that profits so immensely from the talent of young people have a moral obligation to protect them, not just when they are children on a film set, but throughout the entirety of their careers? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. History is filled with brilliant artists who have been tormented by personal demons, from Vincent van Gogh to Judy Garland. There is often a fine, precarious line between the sensitivity that fuels great art and the fragility that can lead to self-destruction. Nick Stahl's story is a modern chapter in that long, tragic tradition. He was celebrated for his ability to convey deep and complex emotions on screen, but he was left to navigate those same overwhelming emotions alone in his own life, with a disease that whispered insidious lies in his ear and promised a false, fleeting escape. The debate is not about whether he was a victim or a perpetrator of his own downfall, but about understanding that he was a human being, struggling with a devastating illness in the harshest and most unforgiving spotlight imaginable. By surviving the abyss that had claimed so many of his talented peers, Nick Stahl's story diverged from the all-too-common narrative of Hollywood tragedy. But survival alone is not redemption. To emerge from such a profound and public rock bottom is one thing. To actually rebuild a life and a career from the ashes is another entirely. The next chapter of his life would not be defined by red carpets or blockbuster premieres, but by the quiet, grueling, and ultimately heroic work of recovery, a fight for sobriety for his family, and for the chance to once again pursue the craft that had been both his gift and, for a time, his burden. The consequences of Nick Stahl's long, harrowing walk through the wilderness of addiction were profound and far-reaching. The most immediate and visible impact was on his career. For the better part of a decade, the actor who had been praised by Roger Ebert and handpicked by Mel Gibson, the man who had anchored a Best Picture-nominated film and led a blockbuster franchise, was virtually unemployable in mainstream Hollywood. His name had become intrinsically linked not with his considerable talent, but with his addiction, his arrests, and his shocking disappearances. The roles he did manage to get during this period were often in low-budget, obscure films that went largely unseen. He had become a ghost in the very industry that had once celebrated him. But the true significance of his story extends far beyond the trajectory of one actor's career. Nick Stahl's very public battle with addiction became a symbol, a stark and painful reminder of the human cost of a problem that was sweeping across America. His downfall coincided with the rise of the opioid crisis and a growing awareness of the devastating impact of methamphetamine addiction. While the media often frames celebrity addiction as a uniquely Hollywood problem of excess and privilege, the reality is that Nick was struggling with the exact same disease that was destroying families in small towns and big cities all across the country. His story, when stripped of the glamour and fame, was the story of millions of ordinary people. A story of pain, desperation, and the all-consuming search for an escape. He also stands as a crucial, living link in the tragic narrative of the lost generation of 90s actors. When we look at the fates of River Phoenix, Jonathan Brandis, and Brad Renfro, their stories end in abrupt and heartbreaking tragedy. They are frozen in time, forever young, their immense potential unfulfilled. They serve as warnings, as cinematic ghosts, as heartbreaking what-ifs. Nick's story is different. He went to the same dark places, he walked to the very edge of the same abyss that claimed his peers, and he stared directly into it. But he didn't fall in. He survived. And that is where the true significance of his story lies today. After hitting a definitive and undeniable rock bottom around 2014, something finally shifted. This was not a single cinematic moment of clarity, but a slow, arduous, and painful decision to live. With the support of his family, who had endured so much, and a renewed commitment to his own life and to his daughter, he began the unglamorous process of recovery. It wasn't a straight line. Recovery rarely is. There were stumbles and setbacks, but this time he stuck with it. He went to 12-step meetings, he got a sponsor, he did the hard, anonymous daily work of rebuilding his life from the ground up, one day at a time, far away from any spotlight. Slowly, tentatively, he began to act again. At first, the roles were small, steps on a long road back to proving himself. He had to demonstrate to casting directors, producers, and insurance companies that he was reliable, that he was sober, and that he was serious about his craft once again. It was undoubtedly a humbling process for someone who had once been a leading man in a multi-million-dollar franchise. But he persevered, driven not by a desire to reclaim his former glory, but by the simple fundamental need to do the work that he loved, the work that had been his calling since he was a child. In recent years, we have witnessed the quiet, steady emergence of Nick Stahl 2.0. He has appeared in gritty, well-received independent films like 2020's Hunter x Hunter, and has had memorable recurring roles in major television series like AMC's Fear the Walking Dead. In 2022, he took on a significant role in the Showtime series adaptation of Let the Right One In, delivering a performance of quiet intensity. The performances are different now. The youthful vulnerability that defined his early work is still there, but it's tempered by a lived-in weariness, a deep sense of gravity that can only be earned through immense suffering. When you watch him on screen now, you are watching a man who has been to hell and back. You can see the history in his face and the pain in his eyes. But you can also see something else, something that wasn't there before. A profound and hard-won resilience. His story has evolved into one of hope. It is a powerful demonstration that recovery is possible, that no one is a lost cause, and that it is entirely possible to come back from the darkest and most desolate of places. In a culture that is often quick to discard and ridicule those who stumble, his comeback is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. He has spoken openly and honestly about his past struggles, not with shame or self-pity, but with a calm, reflective desire to help others who may be facing similar battles. By refusing to hide from his past, he has transformed his private pain into a public message of hope, helping to destigmatize the very disease that nearly cost him everything, Why does Nick Stahl's story still matter? It matters because it forces us to look at addiction not as a moral failing, but as a public health crisis that can affect anyone, regardless of their status or success. It matters because it is a cautionary tale about the immense pressures we place on young people in the entertainment industry and the desperate need for better, more compassionate support systems. But most of all, it matters because, unlike so many similar stories, it did not end in tragedy. It is an ongoing story of survival, a narrative that has finally moved beyond the spectacular fall and is now focused on the quiet, steady climb back up. He reminds us that the final chapter is never written until it's over, and that the quiet, daily work of rebuilding a life can be the most heroic act of all. When we look back at the young boy in The Man Without a Face, with those impossibly old, sad eyes, it's tempting to think that his fate was somehow pre-written, that the same sensitivity that made him a brilliant actor also destined him for a life of pain. But that would be too simple. It would rob him of his agency, of the courageous fight he has undertaken to reclaim his life. His journey is a testament to the fact that our past does not have to define our future. The headlines of his downfall are now just a part of his story, not the entirety of it. They are the record of the storm he weathered. The real story, the one that matters now, is the quiet aftermath, the daily commitment to sobriety, the mending of relationships with his family, and the slow, steady, grateful return to the craft that has been the one constant in his life. Nick Stahl's story is not a simple cautionary tale anymore. It has evolved into something far more complex and infinitely more hopeful. It is a story about the devastating power of addiction, but also about the incredible life-affirming power of recovery. It is a reminder that rock bottom is not an endpoint, but can be the foundation upon which a new life is built. He didn't become the global superstar that Terminator 3 promised, and perhaps that is a blessing. Instead, he has become something far more rare and much more important, a survivor, an artist who is back to doing the work he loves, and a man who has looked directly into the abyss and chosen day after day to walk away. His greatest role may not be one he ever plays on screen, but the one he is living every day, a quiet, powerful performance of resilience, redemption, and grace.